It was a quiet morning in the outskirts of Bristol. The sun had barely risen when Margaret carefully placed a single candle on the kitchen table. She glanced at the clock, 6:45 a.m., then at the untouched living room where shoes were scattered and yesterday's dishes sat in the sink. Her heart beat a little faster, a strange mix of hope and dread twirling inside her chest. Today was her birthday. She had reminded them only once the week before. Just once. She told herself that was enough. If they cared, they would remember. If they didn't, she didn't want to beg for affection. Not this year. The scent of burnt toast filled the air as she tried to keep herself busy. Margaret adjusted the hem of her cardigan and checked her phone. No messages. No missed calls. Only a group chat about the school fundraiser and a discount code for an online shop she never used. By 8 o'clock, the house had woken. Her teenage son stormed through the kitchen looking for his trainers. Her husband, Edward, shouted from upstairs about his missing tie. No one looked at the table. No one noticed the candle. Margaret offered her usual soft smile and packed their lunches. She ironed Edward's shirt and handed it to him without a word. She tied her son's scarf as he rushed out the door and kissed the top of his head. He didn't look back. At 8:45, the house was quiet again. She sat down at the table and lit the candle. The tiny flame flickered in the morning light, casting a soft glow on her face. She took a deep breath and whispered, "Happy birthday, Margaret." There was no cake. No card. No flowers. But in the stillness, something began to shift. She sat there for a long time, not crying, not angry, just aware. Aware of how invisible she had become, how much of herself she had handed over through the years. And how little was ever handed back. Outside, the wind picked up. The neighbor's dog barked at nothing. Margaret reached for her coat and scarf, her hands steady. She would walk today. Not to the market. Not to the school. Just walk. No errands. No purpose. Just her. She stepped out the door and closed it quietly behind her. The candle remained lit on the table. Margaret walked without haste, her boots pressing softly into the pavement. The air was crisp, the kind that kissed the cheeks and made every breath feel clean. She passed the row of terraced houses, each nearly identical, with tired window panes and garden gnomes collecting moss. As she reached the high street, the town began to stir around her. Schoolchildren in oversized coats tugged at their parents' arms, buses hissed along the road, and the usual queue had already begun forming outside the bakery on the corner. She paused in front of the bakery window, gazing at the display. The pastries were arranged with care, almond croissants dusted in icing sugar, jam-filled donuts, buttery danishes. For years, she had passed this very window on her way to do something for someone else. Groceries for the house. Forms to sign at school. Prescriptions to collect for Edward's mother. But not once had she stopped for herself. Today, she did. Inside, the warm scent of cinnamon and fresh bread wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. A young girl behind the counter looked up and smiled. "Good morning. What can I get you?" Margaret hesitated. It had been so long since someone had asked her that without it being about dinner or chores. "I'd like the cherry scone," she said finally. "And a cup of tea. Earl Grey, if you have it." Of course. She took a seat by the window, placing her scarf neatly on her lap. Her hands were still, no longer occupied with doing things for others. She looked out at the world and let herself feel the space around her. The scone was warm and crumbly. The tea was strong, the way she liked it. As she ate, she heard snatches of life around her. A couple arguing gently about a dog leash. A mother bribing her child with a gingerbread man. Laughter from the kitchen. Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years, presence. She wasn't planning the next task. She wasn't worrying if Edward had remembered to email the accountant or if her son had finished his homework. She was just there. Herself. When she finished, she left a generous tip and stepped back onto the pavement. The sky had brightened, though clouds gathered in the distance. She pulled her coat tighter, not from the cold, but from something awakening inside her. Across the street was a charity bookshop she used to visit when she was younger, before marriage, before children, before she became a schedule more than a soul. She crossed the road. The bell above the door gave a soft chime as Margaret stepped into the charity bookshop. The scent of old paper and wood polish wrapped around her like a memory. Dust motes danced in the air, lit gently by the morning light streaming through the narrow windows. The shop was nearly empty, save for an elderly man behind the counter, hunched over a crossword puzzle. He looked up, nodded politely, then returned to his pen. Margaret wandered slowly between the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines. History. Gardening. Travel. Cookery. Her eyes paused at a worn blue spine with gold lettering, Poems for the Quiet Soul. She pulled it free and opened to a random page. There is no music in a woman's silence. But there is power. She closed the book gently, pressing her fingers against the cover as if it might pulse with something long buried. As she moved through the rows, a soft laugh escaped her lips. She had once dreamed of being a writer. Not famous, not grand. Just someone who wrote things that mattered. She used to scribble lines of poetry in the margins of receipts and keep them hidden in a showbox under her bed. That box was gone now, discarded during a spring cleaning Edward insisted on. No point keeping old scraps, he had said. In the far corner of the shop, tucked between travel guides and language books, she found a slim notebook with a marbled cover. Blank pages. Waiting. Without thinking, she picked it up and added the poetry book to her other hand. She wasn't sure why, only that she couldn't leave them behind. At the till, the old man smiled kindly. 2 good choices. Margaret returned his smile and paid in coins, then walked back out onto the street, notebook pressed to her chest. She didn't go home. Not yet. Instead, she wandered towards the park at the edge of town. Children's laughter echoed from the playground, birdsong filled the air, and the gravel path crunched softly beneath her feet. She found a bench under an oak tree and sat down. Opening the notebook, she turned to the first page. Her pen hovered. Then, slowly, deliberately, she began to write. The words flowed more easily than she expected. Margaret sat beneath the oak tree for over an hour, writing line after line of quiet thoughts that had long waited for a voice. The wind rustled gently through the leaves above her, and the world around her faded into a soft blur. When her hand grew tired, she closed the notebook and held it on her lap. The last time she had written for herself was before she became a wife, before she became a mother, before every hour was spoken for by someone else's needs. As she looked up, she noticed a woman approaching, a familiar face from the school gates. Her name was Ruth, always friendly, always rushing. Ruth slowed as she neared the bench. Margaret. I thought that was you. Are you all right? Margaret smiled politely. Yes, I'm fine. Just taking a morning for myself. Ruth raised her brows slightly, as if the idea were foreign. That sounds lovely. I don't think I've had a moment alone in months. There was a silence between them, comfortable and strange. Ruth sat beside her without asking, glancing at the notebook on Margaret's lap. Are you writing something? Margaret hesitated. Just some thoughts. Nothing serious. Ruth nodded, then after a pause, said quietly, I used to paint. Before the twins. Before everything. Another silence, then a quiet chuckle shared between them. There was something unspoken that passed between the two women, an understanding, a thread of forgotten selves woven between packed lunches and lost socks. After a while, Ruth checked her watch and stood up. I should go. My youngest will be wondering where I am. She smiled again, softer this time. It was really nice, talking. Different. Margaret watched her go, her figure retreating down the gravel path. Then she stood, placed her notebook carefully in her bag, and walked back into town. She didn't go home just yet. Instead, she walked to the community notice board outside the post office. Flyers cluttered the surface: yoga classes, piano lessons, local drama auditions. Her eyes scanned the colors until she found one, small and almost hidden. Creative Writing Circle, Thursdays at 6:30 p.m. in the church hall. All welcome. No experience needed. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and added it to her calendar. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. By the time Margaret returned home, the light had changed. It was that golden hour just before sunset, when everything looked softer, more forgiving. She turned the key in the door and stepped inside. The candle was still there on the table, now melted into a small puddle of wax. The house was silent. No footsteps, no voices. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant ticking of the hallway clock. She placed her bag down gently and walked into the kitchen. On the counter sat the same half-empty coffee mug Edward had left that morning. A small ring had formed around the base, staining the counter. She didn't clean it. Margaret boiled the kettle and made another cup of tea. Not for anyone else. Just for herself. As the tea steeped, she wandered into the lounge. The television was off. A blanket lay folded on the edge of the sofa, still with a faint scent of her son's shampoo. The room looked lived in but lifeless. She stood there for a while, cup in hand, staring at the photos on the mantelpiece. Smiling family portraits, carefully staged. Holidays by the sea, school award nights, matching jumpers at Christmas. All perfectly framed, all slightly distant. In every photo, she was smiling. And in every smile, she saw it now, something had been missing. Not from the picture, but from the woman in it. She sat down and sipped her tea slowly. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Later that evening, Edward came home. His footsteps were quick, purposeful. He dropped his keys loudly in the bowl by the door and walked straight into the kitchen. Sorry, long day. Did you manage to get the dry cleaning? Margaret looked up from her seat at the table. She didn't answer right away. She simply studied him. The lines on his forehead. The loosened tie. The phone still in his hand. He glanced up. Is something wrong? She shook her head gently. No. Nothing's wrong. I just didn't get around to it. He blinked, surprised. Oh. Right. He left the room, muttering something about emails, and she heard the familiar sound of the office door shutting. Margaret looked down at the notebook in front of her. She opened to a fresh page and began to write again. Not because she was waiting for silence to be filled, but because she was learning to speak her own language again. And in that small, quiet act, she felt her breath return. Thursday arrived with grey skies and drizzle, the kind of weather that seeped into sleeves and turned pavements slick. Margaret stood by the window, watching raindrops trace paths down the glass. The thought crossed her mind not to go. She could easily stay home, light a candle, write alone. But she didn't. At 6:15, she slipped on her coat and tucked the notebook into her bag. She walked through the damp streets of her neighborhood, passing rows of hedges and shuttered shop fronts, until she reached the small stone church with the arched wooden door. A soft glow spilled from the windows of the church hall, warm and welcoming. Inside, folding chairs had been arranged in a loose circle. A kettle steamed gently at the back beside a tray of biscuits. A handful of people, men and women of varying ages, stood chatting quietly, holding cups of tea. No one looked at her with judgment or expectation. One woman, with silver hair and blue spectacles, turned and smiled. "You must be new. I'm Jean. Welcome." Margaret introduced herself with a polite nod, and before long, she found herself seated among strangers, her notebook open on her lap. The session began with a quiet prompt written on a chalkboard: "Write about a room that remembers you." The room fell into silence. Pens moved. Keys clicked for the few using laptops. Margaret stared at the page for a moment. Then, slowly, words came. She wrote about her kitchen. The room that held her every morning. The scent of burnt toast and forgotten birthdays. The way the sunlight fell on the chipped edge of the table. And the candle. Always the candle. As she wrote, her breath settled into a rhythm. She didn't worry about grammar or if it was good enough. She simply let it pour. When time was up, Jean asked if anyone wished to share. A few did, nervous at first, then steadier. The stories were small, personal. A bedroom left behind in childhood. A greenhouse that watched a marriage fall apart. A caravan full of laughter and cigarettes. Margaret surprised herself when her hand lifted. She read her piece aloud, voice calm, almost distant. No one interrupted. No one asked her to hurry. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a breath before Jean nodded softly. "Thank you, Margaret. That was beautiful." Margaret didn't smile right away. Instead, she looked down at her notebook and felt something shift in her chest. Not pride, exactly. Something older than that. A sense of return. That night, she walked home in the drizzle, her scarf damp and her cheeks cold. But her steps were light. She no longer felt like a woman drifting through forgotten rooms. She was coming back into them. Saturday morning came with a hush. The kind of quiet that didn't feel heavy, but clean, like the first page of a book you knew you needed to read. Margaret moved slowly through the house, tidying without rush, folding a jumper here, straightening a cushion there. The usual hum of domesticity. But today, something was different. She paused in the hallway outside the spare bedroom, hand resting lightly on the door handle. She hadn't stepped into that room in years. It used to be hers, before it became a storage space, before Edward started filling it with old files and unopened boxes. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The air was stale, tinged with the scent of forgotten paper and dust. Stacks of folders lined the desk. Shelves were crowded with books that hadn't been read in a decade. But the room still had the same window, still let in the same pale light that used to fall on her writing desk in the early mornings, back when she still believed she was allowed to dream. In the corner stood the old writing desk, partially hidden behind a pile of flattened cardboard. She moved the boxes aside and pulled the chair free. Her fingers brushed across the surface of the desk, pausing at a small drawer. She opened it slowly. Inside were fragments of a version of herself she had long since buried. A dried flower from a book fair. A stub from a poetry reading in Bath. A photograph of her younger self, laughing with wind-blown hair and ink on her fingers. And at the very back, a letter. Folded, worn, but still intact. Her handwriting. A letter she had once written to herself, years ago, during a time when she still thought a change might come from wishing. She unfolded it and read. "Dear Margaret. If you're reading this, I hope you haven't forgotten. That you are more than what they need from you. That you are allowed to want more. That silence isn't strength when it costs your voice. Love. The version of you who still remembers." Margaret sat back in the chair, the letter trembling slightly in her hand. She closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep in her bones. Then she folded the paper again and placed it carefully in her notebook. The house was still. But inside her, something had shifted again. She stood and opened the window. Fresh air swept in, clearing the must. Outside, children played on bicycles, and somewhere, a song drifted from a passing car. Margaret turned back to the desk. She would claim the room again. Not to escape from anyone, but to return to herself. She didn't need to knock. This room had been waiting for her. The morning began like any other. The kettle boiled, the toast popped, and the faint echo of birdsong threaded through the open kitchen window. Margaret stood at the sink, her hands wrapped around a warm mug, staring out into the small garden behind the house. But something was different now. Not in the garden, nor in the sky, but in the woman holding the mug. She no longer moved as if on borrowed time. That afternoon, Edward came home early. He walked in with the usual rustle of his coat, the usual tired sigh, and the usual lack of questions. He kissed her cheek distractedly and asked about dinner. Margaret looked at him and said calmly, "I haven't decided yet." He blinked. "Right. Well, let me know." But she didn't. Instead, she picked up her notebook and went to the spare room, the one that was hers again. She sat at the desk, opened the window slightly, and began to write. Not for anyone else. Not to prove anything. But because her voice had waited long enough. Downstairs, the house moved on as usual, Edward taking calls, the radio murmuring in the background, but she remained untouched by the rhythms she used to answer to. Later, her son came home from school. He called out, expecting her to be in the kitchen or folding laundry. But when he peeked into the spare room and saw her writing, he stopped. "Hi, Mum," he said, a little unsure. Margaret looked up and smiled. "Hello, love." He lingered for a second, then grinned. "That your book?" "Maybe one day," she replied gently. He nodded and left her to it. As the sun began to set, she paused and looked around the room. It was no longer filled with someone else's things. It held her now, her pages, her pen, her breath. And she realized it had taken years to arrive here. Years of saying, sorry, for being tired. Sorry, for needing space. Sorry, for not being enough. But today, there would be no more apologies. Not for the silence. Not for the space she took up. Not for the story she was finally writing. And as the final light of day slipped across the floorboards, Margaret closed her notebook, her hand resting on the cover, steady and sure. She didn't need permission. She already belonged.